now. Here we go. Yeah. So, thank you everyone who's here for coming to our panel on Kropotkin, the personal and the political. A panel that I'm particularly personally excited for. I think it complements more than one of yesterday's panels quite nicely and contains 3 speakers I had to read the work of in preparation for my own master's and PhD. Our first speaker will be Constance Bantman, a historian of French anarchist networks between the 1880s and 1930s. She's particularly specialised in the presence of French anarchists in Britain in this time period. And this year she released her second book, this time focused around French anarchist Jean Grave, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and his networks. And her paper today focuses on Grave and his friendship with Kropotkin. Secondly, we will have David Saunders, a historian of Russia, both imperial and Soviet, with a focus on Anglo-Russian relations and the history of Newcastle upon Tyne. He is the author of Russia in the Age of Reaction and Reform, that focuses on the politics of Imperial Russia between 1801 and 1881. His paper gives some critical perspective on Kropotkin's response to the Logishin affair of 1881 and 1882. Our last speaker is Lara Green. Her work focuses on Russian activism in Britain, particularly those involved in revolutionary terrorist organizations, and she's working on a book, I think still, entitled The Russian Free Press Fund, between 1881 and 1925, local, national, and transnational networks. I think we have Lara now as well. Her paper today focuses on age and nostalgia in perceptions of Kropotkin and broader Russian revolutionary networks, and within the context of the Bolshevik Revolution especially. We shall have each panelist give a paper and then continue with questions at the end. And as ever, we encourage viewers to personally ask a question over their microphones to facilitate discussion. But if this is in any way something that you feel uncomfortable with, please feel free to write it in the chat and I will ask our panel. Which we just check that Lara's mic works fine before we go to Constance. Can you hear us, Lara? She might have, oh, I can see Lara. I could hear you briefly as well before. Not anymore. Interesting. Should we start with you then, Constance? You have the floor. Do you want to share your screen, or are you okay without?
No, I'll start with that. So my presentation, at your invitation, Sean, is going to be very informal, actually. And it's really, I've written in quite an academic and dry way about this topic, as you mentioned. So I'm showing this mainly so you can see who Grave is, what he looks like. That's Jean Grave. That's my book. And I've written quite a lot about this friendship between Grave and Kropotkin. And actually, I really relish this opportunity to approach the subject in a more informal way today. So I hope you don't mind. I don't have a PowerPoint, and it's really going to be a talk, quite literally, as opposed to a presentation. So Kropotkin and Grave. So first of all, what's the rationale for the paper? Some of you, I expect, are familiar with Jean Grave. So this is a lifelong friendship, pretty much. Kropotkin and Grave met in the early 1880s and sort of parted ways at Kropotkin's death. And they hadn't been in touch for a couple of years when Kropotkin died, pretty much since he left for Russia in 1917. And Grave found out about the death, the passing of his old friend, through the press, and proceeded to edit what I find is an extremely moving document, which is a special pamphlet of the Groupe de Propagande par l'écrit, which is the latter-day embodiment of Les Temps Nouveaux, which was very much their baby, their boy, as both of them described it. But in the meantime, between the early 1880s and the early 1920s, what we are looking at is very much an activist friendship where the personal and the political are deeply entangled. So as I've mentioned, they met just a few years after the setting up of Le Révolté, which Kropotkin had launched in Geneva along with Reclus and Cherkasov and Herzig and a number of other activists. And Grave was just starting his career at the time, his activist career. He was, at the time, in his mid-20s. He'd been evolving and becoming politicized since the early 70s, of course, the Paris Commune being a foundational moment for him. And he had been toying with a number of revolutionary movements, such as Guedism, the French proto-Marxist movement. And by the late 70s, early 80s, we find him on the Paris sort of proto-anarchist club scene, starting to correspond with various groups. Grave was always a man of the written word, and tentatively sending letters and essays to Le Révolté. And he recalled in his memoir that one of these letters was accepted, and he was really emboldened by then. The meeting between Kropotkin and between Grave and this group of Geneva activists is mentioned and alluded to in a number of memoirs, Grave's own, Kropotkin's memoir as well, Reclus, but there are scant details. So we can assume that it did happen through the press, and that they met in Paris just a couple of years later, probably around 82. There are divergent dates for this, when Kropotkin was traveling through Paris and called upon the young Grave. By 1883, Reclus had suggested that the editorship of the paper be handed over to Grave, and Grave relocated to Geneva to take this on and really expanded it. But this was really the beginning of years of editorial, intellectual cooperation between the two of them and a broader circle. And also a sort of precious friendship. In 1885, Grave's wife died, and if we look at the letters between both men, so they are kept for the correspondence from Kropotkin to Grave. This is held at the Institut Français d'Histoire Sociale in Paris, and Grave's letters are accessible with considerable difficulty at the Moscow State Archives, and that's how we can piece together this friendship. And of course, these are very precious documents. But if we look at the letters from Kropotkin to Grave, we see that this is when Grave's wife died. We don't even know her name. This is when they shift from vous to tu in French, which of course is a significant evolution, and from there on there was clearly a lot of affection between the two of them. So why does this matter? I think there are a number of significant points. The first one is really what we are looking at is networks of intellectual and editorial collaboration. So this has been studied by Federico Ferretti, for instance, in the case of Reclus, and we have something very similar with Grave. These exchanges, documented primarily through their sustained correspondence, which show, first of all, how they kept on looking after the papers together. So Kropotkin had pretty much relinquished formally Le Révolté, which then became La Révolte, which then became Les Temps Nouveaux, but he kept a really significant involvement in the paper in many ways. He advised Grave on what to publish, what to look at for. Of course, he published his own writings there. I'll come back to this. He contributed to the papers very significantly in a financial way. If we look at the post-war editions of Les Temps Nouveaux, which Grave really painfully resurrected, we see Kropotkin among the first donors, making a significant financial contribution. So we have these networks of intellectual mutual aid, and this is an essential vector, and I would argue for the broader history of European anarchist communism, we do have to look at this intellectual partnership, because it was quite important for the elaboration and dissemination of these ideas, as part, of course, of a wider nexus, which also included many people that both of them were connected with. I've mentioned another aspect of this editorial partnership is the link with freedom, which, of course, Kropotkin went on to launch in London in 1886, and which was defined as the brother in arms of well, Les Temps Nouveaux, that's when the mention appeared, but there was really the sense of a partnership between both papers, a lot of translation reprints between both papers, a lot of editorial networks at play, a lot of exchanges of information. For instance, this was another important nexus in the pro-Spanish campaigns, which started in the 1890s, and they organized these sort of Spanish atrocities campaigns in tandem. And this was one of many examples of this partnership. As I've mentioned before, the French papers remained a very important publication outlet for Kropotkin. This has been written about by Ian MacKay in Anarchist Studies, which very conveniently inventories all the publications of Kropotkin in these French papers. And this was really significant, in addition to the support, the advice, the dialogue between both men, which fed into these publications. And similarly, Kropotkin, she gave Grave a lot of feedback and advice on his own writing. So that's also where the sort of prehistory, if you like, of these important theoretical works can be found. So there is this argument in terms of looking really at the making of the big theoretical documents, be it the press or the theoretical works that we work so closely with. And this was an important partnership in sustaining it. I would argue more broadly that it's really important to consider the social and emotional history of politics and activism for a number of reasons. Again, this is a matter of grounding, anchoring the sort of big history, the high history of politics and political ideas. So through Grave and Kropotkin, for instance, we gain privileged insights into the history of key anarchist concepts such as propaganda by the deed or syndicalism, of course. And it really adds a strong element of dialogue, sometimes contention in the history of these discussions. So if we look at the correspondence, for instance, we do have a sustained exchange of ideas over violence. They didn't quite see eye to eye on this. The paper reflects this. But it's really fully documented in the letter. And same for syndicalism, where initially Kropotkin was more in favor of syndicalism. And his early enthusiasm for direct action, for mass mobilization spurred by the 1889 strikes in Britain was really enthusiastically relayed in La Révolte at the time, with this landmark article called Ce que c'est qu'une grève, what a strike really looks like. And Grave was far more cautious. And again, this is reflected in the letters, and there is a lot of discussions, debates happening. We see Kropotkin shifting a little later when there is this whole current fearing a takeover of anarchism by syndicalism, and moving around towards the positions held by Max Nettlau in this respect, for instance. So again, I think if we do not look at ego documents, if we do not look at these sort of small networks, which are friendship networks, intellectual friendship networks, as well, we do miss out this broader history, which is so important for the history of ideas. I would argue that this is even more important in transnational contexts, such as that of Grave and Kropotkin. Grave did not move so much. Once he came back from Geneva in the mid-1880s, he did not really relocate outside France until the First World War, when he moved to England to be with the family of his second wife. And in the meantime, of course, Kropotkin was very mobile, even within Britain, moving to Brighton, going, well, on holiday, but more sort of prompted by health reasons, to Italy, traveling back to France, brief stay in America. And it's easy, even for very important and visible activists, especially Kropotkin, but to a lesser extent Grave, to actually lose track of these connections, because they do not necessarily operate at the level we look at primarily, which is the national framework for Grave. It's very easy to consider him exclusively in a national framework, but a whole host of really essential connections gets lost. And I would argue to some extent that it's the same for Kropotkin, where these shifting geographical networks might not be as visible just due to permanent or constant moves. So as I've mentioned, these links are really important to understand the social, the collaborative nature of intellectual history. I would argue that it has significant revisionist implications when we look at both men specifically and at the broader history of anarchist communism, bringing us, of course, to the manifesto of the 16 and the First World War, again, looking at the letters, some of which are really famous, but not all of them. And what these letters show, if we really follow the intense dialogue between both men, between the outbreak of the First World War and the penning, the joint penning of the manifesto of the 16th, what really comes through is a lot of friction. Of course, Kropotkin was fairly determined from the start. We know he had his position in favor of intervention, whereas Grave gradually came round to his positions. And what the friendship element brings to the discussion, of course, is the weight of emotional ties in him being rallied around. I'm not saying this in a dismissive way to say, well, he just followed his friend in there, but there is an emotional discussion, notions of fidelity, for instance, that are really important in understanding the formation of political alliances and networks. And we really see this playing out in the manifesto of the 16 and its prehistory over these 2 years. And this brings me to a point, which Nadine Willems has written about in relation to the manifesto of the 16th, is that, again, if we do not consider these personal bonds, we will miss out on the formation of networks, an essential element, because these, without being completely deterministic, these ties between activists were essential in taking sides. There were generational ties, for instance, and the people who followed Kropotkin and Grave with the manifesto of the 16th were partly activists from the First International Geneva sort of generation, as opposed to a younger generation. Again, this is a very broad generalization, but it is an important element. And conversely, I think if we miss out that friendship dimension, this emotional bonds, we do really miss an important element that is significant in understanding why the war and the schism within the anarchist group was such a traumatic event, and what happened subsequently to the French and international anarchist movement. So I think this is a really important aspect to take into account, in addition to its own merit, of course, in helping us understand how the anarchist milieu functioned, how activists interacted with one another, the ties of friendship, enmity that are so pivotal in understanding a movement like anarchism. And I will conclude with a remark on gender, because looking again at Grave and Kropotkin, I think this is one way of bringing in women into the narrative. And of course, women tend to be notoriously absent from this anarchist history. It was great to hear about Maria Goldsmith the other day, Mary Goldsmith, sorry. And with Grave and Kropotkin, we do see strong figures emerging. So it was Kropotkin who introduced Grave to his second wife, Mabel Holland Grave. He'd clearly spotted the affinity between these two people who did become lifelong partners. And Mabel became really close friends with the Kropotkins, and there is a correspondence between her and Sophie, later Sasha as well. So we do see women appearing in the narrative, in this friendship, and because they were friends as well, women, romantic bonds were part of the activist relationship as well. Mabel was actually connected with other anarchist wives, such as Christian Cornelissen's wife, and these are other networks. But I think it's really important, the minute you look at Kropotkin and Grave, you do see strong activist women appearing. And I would argue that this is yet another argument in favor of exploring this particular friendship, but also a broader activist friendships. I'll conclude with that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Constance. It's very interesting talk. A lot of the things you talk about as well have kind of, like you mentioned Marie Goldsmith, obviously, but also things about Woodall One, Kropotkin's personal life. But yeah, they're all very connected very nicely to a lot of the other papers. I'm just going to check. Lara, can you speak? Is it possible?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. I'll mute again and wait till my turn then.
Perfect. I'm just going to test. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the video. And this is for David's paper.
Can I just butt in?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't want to present live. I've given the conference a video of my presentation because I have very bad hay fever and I was afraid of breaking down. So you're going to get a video, but I'm here for the questions and that.
Yeah, I had a moment yesterday where my hay fever gave up on me in the evening when I was talking to someone and I just couldn't speak anymore. So yeah. I completely understand.
Right.
So I'm going to play both, one on my computer. I'm going to see if you can hear it on the computer first. So just tell me if you can hear this. I don't think you'll be able to, but I've got a solution if not. Can you hear anything?
No.
That's cool. Let me go back to the beginning. And can you hear this okay?
This is about anarchists and religion, basically. Yes.
Perfect. Is it clear enough as well? Is it loud enough?
It needed to be a bit louder, I would think, but you know, it was okay. I could hear it.
Let me move the computer closer, put the volume up. There we go. I can probably put it up.
First, I have to
How about now?
Yeah, go back to the beginning.
Yeah, I will do. I'm going to play both at the same time now so everyone can see both and hear both. Okay, here we go.
This is about anarchists and religion, basically. But first, I have to set the scene. Here's the village of Logishin on a very large scale map of modern Europe. As you see, it's in the southwestern corner of Belarus. So the first question is, what's it got to do with Kropotkin? Well, what it has to do with him is that in January 1882, Kropotkin published one of his first English language articles about this village, actually in the daily newspaper of my hometown, Newcastle. It was in the Newcastle Daily Chronicle. The story Kropotkin told was this. The governor of the Tsarist province of Minsk, where Logishin was at the time, had taken over the villagers' land and transferred it to himself. But he then got his comeuppance with great difficulty and at great personal cost. The villagers had submitted a formal protest to the governor's superiors in St. Petersburg and had got their land back. So what conclusions did Kropotkin draw from this story? He thought it exemplified the evil of higher authority. According to him, the Logishin affair showed the value of resistance on the part of collaborative local communities. Ultimately, for Kropotkin, it showed the need to do away with strong centralized state systems. Kropotkin went on thinking like this about the Logishin affair. He mentioned the difficulties of the type of land tenure in operation at the village in his article on Lithuanians in Encyclopedia Britannica, which came out not long after his newspaper article. It was surely he who encouraged his friend Stepniak to write about the Logishin affair at some length in Stepniak's book, The Russian Peasantry of 1888. And Kropotkin included accounts of the Logishin affair in both the English and the Russian versions of his memoirs, both of which came out 20 years after his original newspaper article. Modern students of this affair, the Logishin affair, have followed Kropotkin's lead. Andrei Minakov condemned the Minsk governor's treatment of the villagers in a book of 2011 about relations between late imperial Russian provincial governors and the authorities in St. Petersburg. 2 years after that, Anatoly Bozic placed the mistreatment of Logishin at the centre of another study of center-periphery relations in the Tsarist Empire in a specialist article in the journal Vопроsi Istorii 2013. And a Belarusian newspaper echoed all these earlier accounts in a whole-page essay of 2015. So there seems to be agreement. Still, it seems to me that there are two things wrong with what you might call the standard account of the Logishin affair. First, they fail to make clear what is surely its most striking feature. And second, and this is what I'll say most about, they don't take into account all the evidence. I'm going to spend the rest of my time on these two things. But I won't say much about the first of them, what I call the most striking feature of the affair. This is surely that for once, amazingly, a conflict between the upper and the lower echelons of Tsarist society worked out in favour of the latter, the lower echelons. If in his original essay of 1882, Kropotkin meant the events at Logishin to support his antipathy to governments, he would have done well to think again, for it was the central government of the Tsarist Empire that returned the land of the village to the villagers. So the happy ending of the affair from the point of view of the villagers showed that occasionally St. Petersburg could intervene on the right side. Thus, the happy ending was not an advertisement for anarchism. On the contrary, it almost validated the convoluted, multi-level Tsarist administration. Still, be that as it may, there's another and to me more damaging criticism of Kropotkin's and his successors' various discussions of the Logishin affair, and that is that none of these accounts give a full account of the affair. They give only a partial account of it. A source which has apparently not been consulted by any of the writers on the affair suggests that when the villagers resisted the local governor, they were not motivated solely by their attachment to the land. Two files, created by the Foreign Confessions Department of the Tsarist regime's Ministry of Internal Affairs, show that religious considerations also mattered to the villagers. Now, I'm no expert on anarchists, but as far as I know, anarchists are not sympathetic to organised religion. To an anarchist, it seems to me, organised religion can be just as oppressive as secular administration. Perhaps this is why Kropotkin did not say anything about religion when he wrote about Logishin. To judge by Tsarist archival evidence, however, religion mattered at the village. In what remains of my time, I'm going to try to explain why. Here's a picture from Google Earth of Logishin today. As you see, unusually for villages in large parts of Eastern Europe, but actually not unusually for parts of Belarus, the village of Logishin has Catholic and Orthodox churches next to one another. Red brick Catholic on the left, white, onion-domed Orthodox on the right. The churches you see in the picture are actually built after Kropotkin of the Logishin affair, but they express a religious complexity that was very much in evidence even at that time and had been in evidence for decades, in fact, if not centuries. So we come to these files on religion at Logishin, which it seems to me that scholars haven't looked at. In February 1880, the governor of the province of Minsk, not the one who seized the Logishin villagers' land, but his successor, sent the Tsar's Minister of Internal Affairs a long memorandum on the village's problems. Although he conceded that the nature of local land tenure created difficulties, he went on to point out that, at a certain point in the story of the village, quote, the religious question arose too, unquote. He then spent the rest of his memo on the religious dimension of the Logishin affair. The memo was long. I can give you only a taste of it. At the point, the governor said, at the point Logishin became part of the Tsarist Empire in 1795, the Christians in the village were Uniates. I'm not talking about all the inhabitants of the village because there were a large number of Jews there too. The Uniate Church had been founded in 1596 with a view to tempting Orthodox believers to transfer their allegiance to the Pope. So far as Logishin was concerned, the creation of the Uniate Church had the effect over 2 centuries that the founders of that church wanted. By the end of the 18th century, the Christians of Logishin were much nearer to being full-blown Catholics than they were to remembering their one-time orthodoxy. At the point of taking over Logishin, however, St. Petersburg wanted the village to be Orthodox again. The previous year, in 1794, a Russian law had spoken of, quote, the removal of all obstacles to the conversion of Uniates to the Greek Orthodox Church, unquote. In 1795, the minute Russia took over Logishin, the village's 2 Uniate churches and 2,163 men and women were transferred by Russian decree from the Uniate denomination to Orthodoxy. The story of religion at Logishin from then on, from 1795, until just before the Russian revolutions of 1917, is basically one of resistance on the part of the local community to St. Petersburg's enthusiasm for imposing or reimposing orthodoxy. The original enforced transfer did not go well. In 1842, the village's Orthodox church burned down, probably as a result of arson. As the governor put it in his memorandum of 1880, between 1842 and the early 1860s, quote, the inhabitants of the village of Logishin, in whom being Uniate had left a certain feeling of proximity to Catholicism, switched to going to the Catholic Church. And those of them who were least committed to orthodoxy even took part in rituals according to the Catholic rite, unquote. St. Petersburg did not give up. After suppressing the Polish uprising of 1863, it set further action in train at Logishin. The Minsk consistory of the Orthodox Church assumed control of the Catholic Church in the village and enumerated 819 men and 1,068 women there whom it deemed to be Orthodox. This new attempt to impose orthodoxy proved to be, I'm quoting the governor again, completely fictitious and ineffective, unquote. Because after the 1863 uprising, Catholic priests in the western provinces of the Russian Empire were no longer allowed to serve their former parishioners, life events in Logishin, by which I mean births, marriages, deaths, started to take place without being entered in the ecclesiastical registers of any denomination. In due course, the villagers even started performing their own church services. Thus, they became what the governor of Minsk, writing in 1880, called, quote, utter renegades, unquote. the governor felt obliged to acknowledge that the villagers' growing, quote, deviation from orthodoxy had brought the governance of them almost to a state of chaos, unquote. Problems then got worse. St. Petersburg was introducing new arrangements for local government in the western provinces of the Russian Empire. However, new local government agencies required various people to take oaths, and the inhabitants of Logishin were not willing to take oaths administered by Orthodox priests. It would be tedious to go through all the further complexities of religion at Logishin in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. However, they continued to escalate. In July 1878, for example, the inhabitants of the village asked the Minister of Internal Affairs in St. Petersburg for permission to remain Catholic. They claimed that their village had been Catholic since the 13th century and that its Catholic church had been erected in 1634. The Minsk Orthodox Consistory countered on this occasion by telling the Ministry of Internal Affairs in St. Petersburg that it had been trying for decades to switch Logishin and 8 nearby villages, as it happens, from Catholicism to Orthodoxy, and that the suppression of Catholicism in these places in the wake of Russia's defeat of the Polish uprising of 1863 had not been a sudden intervention, but the realization of a long-term goal. I hope by now I've done enough to show that at the very time Logishin was having problems with the question of land ownership, the thing that Kropotkin wrote about, it was also having problems to do with its religious allegiance. Now, of course, there were people on the official side of the fence who claimed that the villagers of Logishin were raising the religious question there simply to give themselves a better chance of getting their way on the question of land tenure. Such people do not seem to have been right, however, because the religious question went on being problematic after the question of land tenure was finally resolved, which it was by Russian law of 1886. Yet another governor of the province of Minsk reported to St. Petersburg in July 1887 that people in Logishin were continuing to profess Catholicism. In June 1905, just after the ongoing revolution of that year obliged Nicholas II to promulgate his celebrated Edict on Freedom of Conscience, Alexander Uligin, yet another of the many ministers of internal affairs in St. Petersburg who had to think about Logishin over the years, told yet another governor of Minsk that he had received from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs a petition which people in Logishin had submitted to the Pope's State Secretary in Rome. They had asserted in this petition to the Pope that their, quote, religious needs remain unsatisfied owing to the absence in the said place, Logishin, of a Roman Catholic Church, unquote. They were asking whether they could now build such a church. They got their way. And the red brick building on the left of my picture duly came into being in 1909. So, to conclude, I'm claiming that although you would not know it from Kropotkin's article of 1882, or from his memoirs, or from the various modern accounts of the Logishin affair, religion played a large part at Logishin. Whether it was more or less important than the question of land tenure is a moot point. But in view of the fact that it seems to have been just as contentious as the land question, and for a longer period of time, it can certainly be held to challenge the current conventional view that economic relations were the main thing that mattered to the villagers. Kropotkin, Stepniak, and the modern scholars who have written about Logishin were either positively hostile to religion or unlikely to attach much importance to it. But it played a significant part in the life of the villagers. One of Kropotkin's most famous books is called The Conquest of Bread, but people do not live by bread alone.
Oh, thank you for that, David. That was a nice ending line as well. And I wonder if let me stop sharing my screen first. Just before we start Lara's paper, I wonder if someone who knows more than me in the chat might want to speculate about Kropotkin's views on religion, because I'm not sure. I assume that he has anti-religious opinions because Bakunin did, and a lot of anarchists did. But I'd be interested if anyone would like to chime in for the post discussion. Lara, would you like to share slides, or are you just going to talk?
I'll not try and share slides because I think that might add another layer of complication to this. So luckily I've managed to download the app on my phone, which seemed to be the answer. So if I cut out, I'm really sorry. I just moved to a new country. Don't you have internet in my apartment? So everything has been a bit chaotic. But thanks again to the organisers, and especially to Sean for inviting me to talk today. I had a few slides, but really I'll just talk to you about some of the cartoons that were on them at the relevant points. So I titled my talk Kropotkin, Aging, and the Russian Revolutionary Movement in the Transatlantic Imagination. And I came at this topic because I was interested in how Kropotkin became a kind of image. He became something other than perhaps what he actually was through his mediation in the British and American press. And I came at this primarily from my interest in Russian revolutionary terrorism, because I was interested in how Kropotkin became this kind of anarchist terrorist bogeyman, even though there's no evidence that he was ever involved in any actual terrorist conspiracies. But then as I started to go on, I saw that his changing image in the British and American press and the Anglophone press was so deeply tied to representations of his body and the idea that the kind of revolution was embodied in him, that I wanted to explore this a bit further. So early in his life, he's this kind of dangerous, infectious, potentially anarchist, terrorist. But as time went on and he aged and he lived abroad, he became this kind of sanctified figure. And it's all kind of related, I think, in some way to his body. The kind of interest in revolutionary bodies is nothing new. I mean, I imagine lots of people here will be aware of the fact, that you can still go and see Lenin pickled on Red Square, even today. And the Russia and the Soviet Union are not the only countries to have preserved the physical bodies of their revolutionaries. And so it seemed to me that there's also a way of kind of thinking about this embodiment in these revolutionaries' lifetimes, and what that might do to perceptions of the revolutionary movements they are involved in. I'm primarily doing this from an external perspective because of the direction I came to this project, but I guess there might be interesting ways we could think about this from the perspective of activists themselves. So the kinds of things I was looking at included local and national newspapers, because I was interested in how these representations existed beyond the capital cities, beyond London, beyond the big papers like the Times, or in the US, New York Times, into even the most kind of local newspapers in rural areas in the US. Quite a lot of fantastic sources in the UK, from Dundee, which had Sophia Kropotkin visit for several lectures, and reported quite regularly on the Kropotkins and what was going on. So there's clearly some kind of local interest as well. Largely, I found that the trends kind of arced across all of these sources. So there was broadly a shift from lots of newspapers talking about Kropotkin as this dangerous anarchist in the early 1880s, and then they all broadly shift over to talking about Kropotkin more sympathetically later on. The only exception I found to this is in Chicago, which, being the site of the Haymarket bombing, naturally has a more hostile relationship to Kropotkin. But what I did see is across the political spectrum, across these large corpuses of newspaper articles, that broadly there's a shift across time to being more sympathetic. So I'm going to focus more on this sympathetic image in this presentation. And it seems to me that it's Kropotkin's incarceration after his trial in France that's the really big catalyst for growing sympathy for him in the Anglophone press. In particular, and the issues relating to his body come through here, heredity, this kind of his noble title, his characteristics that are associated with the title kniaz, which is usually translated as prince, the fact that he has inherited certain values but chosen to reject others from his birth, and these become really important symbols of his admirability. So people admire this about him. Newspapers start calling him the anarchist prince, also sometimes the nihilist prince, which nihilists were what the newspapers at the time would have called Russian revolutionary terrorists. But in line with Kropotkin becoming this more sympathetic figure, we see the word word nihilist becoming a bit more kind of neutral rather than negative at this time. So, this use of the title prince, despite the fact that Kropotkin really doesn't like it, basically defines his image in the press. As well as that, his activities in prison are also a catalyst for sympathy. So the fact that he is doing scientific experiments, lots of newspapers reprint an article where he's writing about his a cat, being able to recognize its own reflection, his experiments in the garden, and the fact that he is still writing, acquiring knowledge. They're interested in what he has to say on a variety of different topics, and he appears regularly in the press. His voice, whether mediated through journalists reporting on his views or sort of reprinting what he is supposed to have written or said, this becomes a really important sort of regular feature in many of the newspapers, and it's syndicated from the national papers into local papers as well. But most importantly for me, for the factor of the body, is that his actual incarceration and his subsequent ill health in prison in France are perceived to be the result of the French state enacting the violence of the Russian state for it, so doing the work of the Tsarist regime. And there's sort of a great growing interest in the treatment of political prisoners in the Russian Empire at this time. People like Stepbiak, as David Saunders has mentioned. And there's kind of growing interest in the treatment there and objections on humanitarian grounds. And so the fact that Kropotkin's health, his body seems to be being harmed by the French authorities becomes quite a powerful symbol of what's wrong with his imprisonment and his trial. I really like that over several papers at this conference we've had mentions of Sofia Grigorievna, and I think it's really important to note here that she contributes to this discourse. Her voice is heard in the press, commenting on the French state's wrongdoing and how they were harming Kropotkin. But so there's a little bit of that, but largely she is also dismissed as sort of representations of Russian revolutionaries and active radical figures are very gendered at this time. So I had this wonderful quote on the slide. I won't read it all out because it's quite long, but she is portrayed as being young and pretty, and it focuses on her appearance. And that's really the kind of representations that we see across all kinds of Russian revolutionaries at this time, particularly Sofia Perovskaya, who was the most prominent of the assassins of the Tsar in 1881. So we can see a very strongly gendered aspect to this too by looking at Sofia. So Kropotkin's body is this kind of target of harm, and it becomes a really important rallying call, campaigns to release Kropotkin from Britain in particular, petitions, letters. And so when Kropotkin is released, it seems that these activists almost feel like they have rescued him, that they have saved him from the harm that was being caused to him. And I think that emotional connection is really important because it echoes in later comments when revolution does come to Russia in 1917 about how British activists in particular feel that this is also our revolution, our cause. So they kind of have that kind of emotional connection to Kropotkin and revolution. And I'll come back to that when I come to 1917 and the Civil War in a moment. Kropotkin arrives in Britain in 1886. As Constance said, he's traveling around quite regularly, but largely he does live in Britain for most of the rest of the time until 1917. That's sort of his primary residence. And he remains, he comes up in the papers. All of his books are obviously well respected, receive really interesting, really detailed reviews. Even his memoirs, although his memoirs are focused on more in terms of what they can tell you about the exciting Russian revolutionary terrorism and those kinds of events, they're still, reviewed and well read. Obviously, across this, what is 3 decades, Kropotkin is aging rapidly, and so his age becomes an integral part of his public image at this time. And it's almost as if the kind of image of the Russian revolutionary movement remains in stasis. So Constance talked about generations. Kropotkin's a member of a generation that has come to activism particularly in the 1870s. And this generation continues to dominate the public image of the Russian revolutionary movement abroad, and Kropotkin in particular, he's the figurehead of it. He becomes known as the grandfather of the Russian Revolution, alongside Yekaterina Brushkovskaya's grandmother. So I had a good cartoon which shows the two of them together. And we see celebrations of his 70th birthday in 1912, articles kind of describing him as this kind of grand old man of politics. And that kind of comes alongside a background more broadly in Britain and the US of the cult of age, of respect for age in politics. So the original grand old man is Gladstone. And although for Gladstone that title is kind of satirical in some ways, it's kind of criticizing him, satirizing, denoting his increasing irrelevance as he ages. It still forms the basis of a cult of personality, and we have other examples like the longest-serving MP becomes known as the father of the House, and in US politics, the Dean of the House of Representatives gains symbolic seniority through long service as well. So his kind of aging body is the place where the revolution is cited because time sort of doesn't move on. The revolution is something that is embedded in that generation so far as British and American observers. are interested in the sort of wider publics here. So when 1917 comes in February, revolution arrives, obviously everyone turns to Kropotkin, asks for his comment, and there seems to be great enthusiasm, Kropotkin returning to Russia and to take the revolution back again with him. And obviously that doesn't go so well for him. We heard about his life in Dimitrov. He's no longer able to live in Moscow after not being there so long. And so he ends up in this small town. And we heard about how, Sophia's garden and how they have this life that is very connected there. But the image in the press of this life is much more negative, the British and American press. So we have kind of articles about visiting Kropotkin that are almost like describing a kind of descent into hell, the chaos and violence that people experience on trains, and trying to get to Kropotkin becomes this kind of pilgrimage of, fraught with difficulty. And Kropotkin's illness in exile becomes a topic of concern as well, and his growing ill health. So when he dies in February 1921, first of all, the Bolsheviks are accused of killing him, and then, if not for actually killing him, for contributing to his decline by not providing him with food or medical care. So the Bolsheviks become, in the Anglophone press, a kind of, they are again harming the body of the revolution, so far as these external observers are concerned. So for me, that's been quite interesting to think about the ways in which not only external observers might have opposed many of the Bolsheviks' actions and activities, but the idea that Kropotkin was the revolution, and then to harm that, or seem to be harming that, contributed to external perceptions. So seeing as I derailed the start time of this panel a little bit with my technical difficulties, I'll round up a little bit here. So so it seems to me that Kropotkin's generation is the one that defines the Russian Revolution for these external observers. And perhaps because individuals like Kropotkin lived for so long, they come to define the revolution themselves. Is that they're almost living history. Their bodies literally bear the scars of the violence of the Tsarist regime, the ill health that they've lived with throughout their lives as a result of imprisonment in Russia in the 1870s and 1880s. And so, in a sense, the revolution becomes this kind of fixed thing in people's minds that obviously is upended when the Bolsheviks take a very different path to the one that has been talked about by individuals such as Kropotkin. So obviously I've been coming at this from a historical perspective and thinking about the kind of dimensions this might have had for the acceptance of Kropotkin abroad, but then also the perceptions of revolution. But I wonder whether reflecting on this idea of embodiment of revolutionary ideas might be important in order to think about how change might be inhibited by sort of attaching these ideas so very deeply into a single individual's body. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lara. When you mentioned the 70th birthday, it reminded me, it's a big part of my research, how like well celebrated his 70th birthday is. He's like the man of the week in the London Daily News, things like that. It's very big event across the papers. But yeah, thank you for your paper. And I've got Dimitri as well. I think that Constance wanted to ask a question. So maybe we'll go to Constance first because she wrote in the chat first.
Yeah, and thank you very much. Thank you, David and Lara, for really great papers. So, Lara, I really like the way you're also looking at aging in British context outside anarchism. But if we go back into anarchism, the parallel for me with Louise Michel is absolutely striking, although, of course, it's clouded by gender. And I was wondering if you have looked at theories of charisma, because I think in sort of studies of charisma in political science, there's quite a lot on the body, and especially the body as a religious object. I mean, you finish with bearing the scars, so scars or stigmata. So I was wondering whether what you make of the, I guess, well, the possible religious subtext as well.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. I think this idea of kind of sanctifying is one that's only come to me recently. So I think it's absolutely something that I need to explore more. Yeah, so Kropotkin is known for being really charismatic throughout his life and being this kind. And obviously, we heard about, his vast correspondence. Everyone wants to write to him, to be in conversation with him. So yeah, I think this is something I would have to go into in more detail. But yeah, thank you very much. I think this is definitely something to explore.
Nice, thank you. I think Cord has a question as well. Would you like to come onto the chat, Cord? And to talk it out in person, or would you like to read it out from the chat? He may have also disappeared briefly. How about we do Dimitri's first, and then Cord can reply or come into the chat? Is that okay, Dimitri? Perfect.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. One for Constance, and it relates. I think the last chapter in your book is called something like isolation and self-memorialization, and we know that Jean Grave or Jean Grave has not been, particularly popular after the First World War, although he lived quite a bit longer and so on. But we don't have any, I don't know, Jean Grave conferences that I know of. Maybe I'm out of the loop and so on. But why do you think there was such difference in their, so to speak, posthumous fate? Because they both signed the same manifesto. They held the same position on the war, but nevertheless. Kropotkin was kind of rehabilitated pretty early on. Thank you. I'll ask another question of Lara a little bit later, if that's okay. Thank you.
Sorry, great question. That's a deep injustice, of course, but I think that the main reason is charisma, again, or the aura of Kropotkin. I think that the question is probably more about Kropotkin himself. Actually, how come Kropotkin could weather this? Perhaps leaving for Russia in 1917 had added, it contradicted the image of the armchair revolutionary that really plagued Grave. So I think there's an element of that, perhaps, but I think he wasn't very well liked beyond his immediate circle. So there's a number of elements there, but that's an ongoing question. Thank you.
Because there was a lot of Jean Grave's books translated into Russian, and he was really popular in the Russian language milieu. But I think there's been into English. There's just been the recent translation of one of his children's books or something like this. And well, he didn't have a beard. Not that I know of.
Fatal error. See, it's all about the body, how you present yourself. There has to be an element of mystique and self-staging.
Was your question to Lara as well, Dimitri, or just to Constance? Sorry.
Yes. I think that one of the projects that Russian anarchists have put a lot of effort into in the early 1920s was publishing an album of Kropotkin's funeral, which I think has been translated into English, published in German. Well, I'm not sure it had an English language version as well. How common it is to in the English language culture to commemorate bodies' funerals, and how strange this Russian revolutionary veneration of relics as a ritual and part of culture that of representations of Kropotkin's body in this case, and how that relates. It's slightly rambling, but I hope you get the gist. Thank you.
As I'm sure you know, Russian revolutionaries throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries are producing these books of memorializing their comrades, whether they were killed in revolutionary action or whether they died of illness or old age. And so yeah, there is this kind of tradition in the Russian Revolution movement of doing this. I'm not sure so much it's one that transfers abroad. So Kropotkin's death, the sort of month or so following his death, we see lots of obituaries, and we see reports of the funeral as well. But largely he then kind of drops off, disappears from the press. And when he then reappears, we see this kind of caricature of him as a revolutionary terrorist. Keeps coming back, actually, although it's not as negative as it was earlier in his life. So I just wonder if the press in Britain and the US has kind of moved on quite quickly, that they were interested in him as an individual so long as they could sort of claim a kind of connection to him. And when he was after he died, that connection, that physical connection, was gone, and the sense that there'd been a kind of way that they'd contributed maybe to his successes, that was lost. And yeah, so I think that maybe that doesn't translate quite so well into the kind of wider culture of kind of the press, but absolutely so interesting to think about the way the revolutionary movement keeps producing these kinds of documents, and the journal category Susilka and things like that. So all these kind of records of lives of friends, autobiographies of prison life, of exile, all keep coming out throughout the 1920s, but it's definitely something that's really interesting to look at.
Thank you.
Oh, nice, thank you. We've got a question from Cord next.
Yeah, it's also for Lara, thanks. Just in literature, when we encounter Kropotkin, often he's this kind of strange figure of disgust also, kind of especially in Joseph Conrad, but also in the Rossetti's writing, where he's this kind of bloated body, also kind of this body out of bounds that cannot be contained, producing rhetoric ceaselessly, but never actually doing anything. And I was just wondering whether this, I mean, that's also, of course, a long tradition of disparaging anarchists with their alleged physical deformities and Lombrosian pathologies and so on. I was just wondering if there is, if a strand of that remains even after his sanctification, and this connection with these romantic narratives of escape and so on. So is there also the kind of bloated, horrible body?
Largely that disappears at the same time as this more kind of sympathetic, almost, sanctification. This process is going on whilst he's in prison. At the time of his trial, there's the kind of rhetoric that you've mentioned. They're commenting on how he looks. The descriptions of him echo the kind of cartoons of Irish revolutionaries at the time, as well as being kind of not human. That their anarchists are described as being hairy. All of these kinds of things come up in depictions of Kropotkin. and also of Sofia Kropotkin as well. I think there's an article in which she's described as looking like a small dog. So, you know, these kind of things come through, but largely it's lost. And I suppose once his through his imprisonment, that's a time when he almost becomes separated from other kinds of anarchism that are seen more negatively, and also from the wider kind of workers' movement as well. So he becomes almost this kind of separate figure at that time. So I think that probably contributes to this changing depiction of him. But yeah, this research will be coming out as an article, and the first section of the article actually deals with that, but it's primarily confined to the earlier period.
Thank you. When you mentioned the Sophia thing as well, it reminded me, there's my hay fever as well. It reminded me that some of these like kind of middle class liberals that I read about a lot during my PhD, a lot of them obviously really like Kropotkin, but some of them also don't really like Sophie that much. And sometimes I've even seen the odd description of Sophie that kind of describes her in kind of a vaguely racist way, that she looks more like Asiatic than Kropotkin does. And I think that's because she's from a more kind of Central Asian Jewish family, right? And Kropotkin obviously is, you know, from aristocratic Western Russia. And yeah, I just wonder if that also plays into that perception of Sophie. I can't remember where I saw it, but I've certainly seen the word Asiatic used to describe her in a critical way, which I thought was very odd. I have a question for David afterwards. Oh, sorry, Lara, you respond first.
It's okay. That's not really something I picked up on, but it's really interesting. I'd really like to talk to you about that. I found that largely when Peter Kropotkin becomes more respected in the press, so does Sophia. But I'd be really interested to think about how maybe the more private aspects of these kind of networks were harboring racism and anti-Semitism as well.
Oh God, I hope I can find that mention now. Don't quote me on it until I find it. And I can't remember where it was either. But I certainly remember that vaguely. I have a question for you, David. Let me try and remember what it was. It's been a very long morning.
I'm having the same problem. I've got all sorts of comments I want to...
yes. You can do yours after. My question was going to be, so you mentioned that he wrote these articles in the Newcastle Chronicle. I know that was a place that Kropotkin was published in, like one of the first places he was published in Britain. But I know that 1881, 1882 is quite early for Kropotkin to kind of be a name. I was wondering if his articles on the Logishin affair, if they were like well received, if people talked about Logishin and referenced his perspective, because I know that often these Russian figures, they come to Britain and they have this kind of air of authority on certain topics, obviously Russia being one of them, but also on agriculture and a few other topics. And I'm not sure that sometimes it doesn't quite hold up, but rarely. Normally they're like much more an expert than a British person. But I just wondered, if it was influential, if people respected it, despite, as you say, there were quite a lot of problems.
Yeah, that's actually a very big issue. First, on the date, 1881, 1882 really is very early for Kropotkin to have dealings in the UK. He did spend a year in England before 1886. He found England wholly unacceptable from the point of view of trying to get sympathisers at that time. The reason he had articles in the Newcastle newspaper, there were 5 at the turn of 1881, 1882, is that he'd met the local MP, Joseph Cowan, at the Anarchist Congress in London in 1881, in the summer of 1881. What Cowan was doing there, I have no idea. Cowan was not an anarchist, although he was a most unusual liberal MP. But they certainly met. Cowan owned the Newcastle newspaper, and he must have said to Kropotkin, I've been able to pin this down, unable to pin this down, but, you know, if you've ever got anything for us, send it. And Kropotkin did. He sent a number of articles, 1881, 1882. I don't know whether payment is involved. One thing I would like to hear more about from perhaps the other two speakers or anyone at this conference is Kropotkin's self-funding. Over his lengthy period abroad, I know that he was paid for his Encyclopedia Britannica stuff, and insofar as you can work it out, he's, you know, these payments are important to him. Whether Cowan was paying him, I don't know, but Cowan certainly helped other Russian revolutionaries. He'd been friends with Herzen in the 1850s and 60s, although as far as I can see, they never met. But Cowan was rich. He owned a brickworks, and he sold his bricks all over the world. Don't forget that Tyneside is a rundown place now, but in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, it was leading the world in ship construction and so on. There was a lot of money there. So my guess is, I'd like to say further about this Logishin. It's just one of a series of articles in which Kropotkin is laying out his positions. They're not overtly anarchist at this stage. I wanted to ask sort of everyone really about the periodization of Kropotkin's career. My impression is that he was by no means hostile to the more violent revolutionaries of his generation, at least around the 1880 point. After all, one of his best friends in the 1880s and 1890s was Stepniak, who was a murderer, had murdered the police chief in St. Petersburg in 1878. It is said that Stepniak became a moderate in his time in England, but I wonder whether both Stepniak and Kropotkin are above all anxious to attract sympathizers, and they I wonder if they modify their opinions accordingly. So periodization interests me. I really liked Constance's stuff about networks, and especially women. Again, I think of, you know, my hero is Robert Spence Watson, who was the founder of the British Society of Friends of Russian Freedom, which he founded with Kropotkin and Stepniak in 1889. But Kropotkin was just as close to Mrs. Spence Watson, Elizabeth Spence Watson, and remained close to her after Spence Watson died in 1911. I mean, there'll be people in this conference who know more about, well, Sean, for example, about Kropotkin's correspondence than I do. But he's certainly writing to Elizabeth Spence Watson just before he departs for Russia in, was it May, June 1917. She wants him, because it was quite difficult making the journey, she wondered if he would be travelling via Newcastle, because there was a lot of, you know, Zamyatin came to England in 1916 through Newcastle. This was a standard route. Bukharin was arrested in Newcastle in 1916. This was a major port. It's not the only one. Dundee has cropped up in this session. But yeah, Mrs. Spence Watson, I thought about on the connections. Lara mentioned father of the house. I don't know who the first father of the house was, but I wonder if it was Thomas Burt, who was MP for Morpeth and lived in Newcastle. He was certainly father of the house by the time he finished. He died in, he left Parliament in 1918 after 44 years in the House of Commons. And he was a Newcastle person whom Kropotkin certainly met. He can be shown to have met in the decades before that. So maybe somehow this name that Burt acquired transferred itself to Kropotkin. I do genuinely wonder, we've heard a lot at this conference about Kropotkin's ratting on the cause of anarchism in the First World War. I don't think there's any doubt that he did rat on the cause. Had Robert Spence Watson still been alive in the First World War, he would have been completely appalled by Kropotkin's attitude to the war, because one of the things that seems to be true of Spence Watson throughout his life was his utter commitment to pacifism. No, Spence Watson was no anarchist, but he was a pacifist. And yet Kropotkin is not a pacifist in World War One. So I wonder if Kropotkin actually is becoming more moderate, or whether in the 30, 40 years he was in the West, or whether he is just tempering his ideas. I'll shut up now. But I mean, lots of things have been crossing my mind as you've been speaking, all of you. I mean, Dimitri too, yesterday. I've had big communication problems all through the conference. It seems to be working perfectly this morning. So it's really good to get some of this stuff off my chest. I'll shut up now.
I'm glad, David. I'm glad you're able to speak. I was going to answer one or two of the things you said, actually, and then I mentioned Lara and Constance might have things to say. And I think he earned a lot of his money, actually, as Dimitri mentioned, from his scientific publications. I know that he got quite a regular salary from just James Knowles, from the editor of the 19th Century, did a recent science column, and Kropotkin was the writer of that from 1892 to like 1910 or something. And it was the bane of his existence. He was very busy with it all the time, and he complained about it all the time. But it was the thing that brought in readily brought in money for him on a regular basis, rather than the scattershot books and speeches and stuff. Yeah, I forgot another thing I was going to say. But if Constance and Lara have responses to David, or even Dimitri, that would be welcome.
I can jump in with something brief. I know that David will know my opinions on Kropotkin's views on violence from the article that we wrote together on Stepniak's Career of a Nihilist, the novel. From my perspective, I'm not ever sure that these individuals are ever become more moderate in their attitudes to violence, but perhaps that it's just the way that they write about it for different audiences. So, I mean, I'm primarily, I've written about Kropotkin in this case, but I mainly write about other Russian revolutionaries such as Stepniak. And it seems to me that terrorism is the constant where other political ideas might be more fluid. So, and I think maybe it does come into this idea about historicizing and the kind of stasis of the revolutionary movement and its identity, because individuals from this community continue to be very active and well respected, and to often be in control of some quite influential newspapers, especially among the emigre community, that their views and their memorializations of their former comrades who've been executed or have since died, that this kind of dominates this kind of media culture. So yeah, I'm still not sure what I think there, but I would hesitate to say that Kropotkin becomes more moderate in this. I think he's definitely still trading on it, but just in a particular there's a particular way of writing about it for a British and American audience.
And then very briefly on women, I think bringing several strands of discussion together. This is actually not my work, but if some of you attended the July Brazilian Kropotkin conference, a US scholar called Sarah Richter gave an amazing paper on Sophie Kropotkin, and not quite evidencing very progressive positions from Kropotkin. It was a little bit sort of her endorse, basically. And this was really interesting because it does make you think of it. You might have close partnerships, but even then you need to look even more closely. I think this one was about how he wrote about her, how she featured in his writing, about the invisibilization of her intellectual and material contribution. So I think that's perhaps a qualification of my earlier point, which is it's not enough to say women are surprisingly present in contrast to other quarters within the anarchist movement. They're prominent, they're foregrounded, say in Kropotkin's relationship, but you need to look even more closely to say actually to what extent is this actually progressive, even by the standards of the time.
Yeah, nice. I was just going to respond very quickly as well to when you talk about Kropotkin's writing. From my awareness, I think that when he first came to Britain, nearly all of his writing was about Russia and a little bit about prisons, right at the beginning of the 1880s. And then the mid-1880s, he writes a little bit about anarchism, very, very briefly for like a year or two, and then starts to throw himself into mutual aid. And I feel like you could make an argument, I'm not sure if it's the case, that he comes to Britain, everyone's interested in Russia, and then he starts to write about anarchism, and then maybe that's not quite as popular, as more controversial, and he starts to retreat into a more scientific, slowly coming to the point about anarchism, where he's talking about mutual aid for a very long time, over many, many years. And the ultimate conclusion you don't realize until like into it, if you're not an anarchist, is that he's going to make an anarchist argument out of mutual aid, obviously. And then Conquest of Bread other books come later.
Yeah, I agree. When did he write his Encyclopedia Britannica article on anarchism? Because I remember looking at this in connection with this conference. I mean, I used the 1911 edition. There was an earlier article on anarchism in the Encyclopedia Britannica by somebody else. And I just wonder if, Kropotkin is sort of coming clean on anarchism in a sort of defining article as late as 1911. Has he written it for that? It's something like the 11th, I don't know, 10th or 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Cord said 11th.
I beg your pardon?
Sorry, Cord said 11th in the chat, 11th edition,
Okay.
1910.
Oh, yeah. Thanks very much, Cord. So 1910. Yes, I've got the year wrong. Yes, I'm looking at the chat now. Silly me. So it was composed then, but does he have significant, because it's a lengthy article, it's not just it's sort of pamphlet length, does he have statements of his version of anarchism easily accessible before then? I mean, is he known as an anarchist in English speaking countries? Well, that's my question.
I think he does, but I think he's not. I think it's both yes and no, and that he does definitely have writings about that, like Anarchist Morality is very early, like 1885, and I'm sure
you get odd chapters in his famous books. The books of the 1890s.
But I think he's not known as that weird. I think he's more known in Britain as a Russian revolutionary activist, maybe a nihilist as well, quite a few times.
Yeah, nihilist was just a generic.
Yeah, I know.
Wasn't it, in English? I mean, there's a chapter in, I don't know, is it in Conquest of Bread, Anarchist Communism? I think it actually has that title. But
I know that like he intentionally wrote Fields, Factories and Workshops, which is his first book published in Britain, like non-revolutionary, so that it would appeal better to liberals. And it doesn't mention any things about revolution in it. I think it doesn't even use the word revolution. It certainly doesn't use the word anarchist once. And that's like 1897. That's like his first book in Britain.
Right. Conquest of Bread was earlier in French, wasn't it?
Yes, of course.
It's 1892. I'll have to check afterwards. I can't remember. Maybe Cord knows this too. Got them all on the shelves.
I wonder if I might jump in there just to think about the meanings and terminology here, is that I think that these terms don't really have fixed meanings at this time, and that the context is more important. So I used a large corpus of newspaper articles, but I found that really what I needed to do was just read them, that there was no way that I would have been able to ascertain the meaning of these terms without the contextual information in that article. So anarchist is a term at this time where Kropotkin's The Anarchist Prince, which is great. Anarchists are bad because they're bombing in France and Spain. And then the Bolsheviks also get called anarchists later. And I think that it's the context really that is most important for this.
Anarchists did use the term anarchist of themselves, didn't they?
Definitely.
In distinction from other sorts of revolutionary. I mean, there are anarchist congresses, so to which non-anarchists, with the exception apparently of Joseph Kahn, didn't go. You know, this is a terrible small minority, but these congresses are perhaps not designed for the Western people in whose countries they're taking place.
Well, I kind of wonder as well. I wonder if there's this kind of there's like these two anarchist figures almost as we enter in the 20th century. Because I remember during our discussions that in 1912, Enrico Malatesta is like arrested in Britain, and I can't remember what he's charged with, but he's charged with like quite a high crime. And Kropotkin obviously tries to help and intervene and uses all of his liberal friends to help. And the editor of The Nation is quite heavily involved, H.W. Massingham. And the way The Nation frames the subject is that the judge who's calling Malatesta a violent criminal, etc., doesn't understand anarchism, doesn't understand that this man is a pacifist. And if he needs to understand anarchism, he needs to read Kropotkin. And I think that there's this kind of dual anarchist idea. There's the ones that blow things up, and there's Kropotkin, and then Kropotkin's vouching for other people in like the 1910s, which is, I'm not saying that these things all work very well, but it seems to be a thing in Britain. Did you want to say something, Cole? Sorry.
No, there were also these explainers, and I don't know if you found those, Lara, in the newspapers, where often you had these correspondents saying, "Okay, anarchist is used in these ways, but what really means is a certain type of philosophical engagement that is completely distinct from the terrorist activities." So there were these attempts of kind of getting a grip on the term, weren't there?
Yeah, and I mean, Kropotkin's political views are actually explored in quite some detail. People realize that people begin to think that he's different from other anarchists. But I think largely, perhaps people who are just reading the news, though, might have encountered these terms in more simplistic use, I think. So yeah, there's some explaining, but also it seems it's kind of overwhelmed by a kind of misuse maybe of these different terms.
I think there's some work as well on, and I should wrap up now. So I've already enjoyed the discussion, so I've kind of lost track of time. But there is some discussion as well about the use of the term anarchist and to label people with significant or severe mental health problems. The kind of person who might, who talks to himself in the street or very loudly, or might be described as an anarchist in this time period, and that there's kind of a weird interweaving of, the perceptions of quote unquote madness and perceptions of anarchism. Yeah, I think you're right, Cord. I think Malatesta was early an anarchist. But yeah, I think we should probably wrap up there. Thank you so much for the papers, David and Lara. We've lost Constance, I think. I was going to particularly thank Constance, who is on leave and has phoned in for us. But yeah, thank you so much for your papers. Let me just read the summary I was going to say for later on. This afternoon we have a panel at 1 p.m. on Kropotkin's humanism and his materialism. That's in an hour and 20 minutes, people who aren't on British summertime. And at 3 o'clock British summertime, we have an open discussion of Kropotkin's continued legacy in the context of the 21st century, where we will specifically touch on his ecology, his cooperative views of humanity, and to a lesser extent, his social views. But please do come along and bring your own questions if you have anything you want to discuss, because it's going to be quite a nice open discussion where we'll have as many heads on the screen as possible, all talking to each other. Yeah, and have everyone enjoy their lunch. And
thanks, Sean.
See you all soon. Thanks.